Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Thank you, Jennifer, President Adams, and Tara for that presentation. Delighted to be here. An honor to award the Fiorello LaGuardia Book Prize to you, Kim, for your masterpiece, Fear City, published in 2017. But it still has a timely feel in this era of budget cuts, and maybe we can talk about that later. To begin, though, would you tell us a little bit about your research? Your research was extensive. You visited archives nationwide. You were here at LaGuardia to do research, too, as President Adams indicated. Would you tell us a little bit about your experience here, what collection you used and what you learned, and how you incorporated the material into your book?
Sure. Is this, I'm not sure if this is on or not, but you can probably hear me.
Here, that helps. Okay. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you for being here today. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And Stephen, this is really a great honor to receive this award. I think there should be more awards for books that are not key to the year, because it was just a total surprise to get this and to open one's email and find this. But it also, I think it actually is, it's a wonderful idea for an award to connect it to the archive. And this is really a wonderful archive. Those of you, I'm a historian, so this is what I like to do, is look through people's mail and and notes and memos and letters and things they had kind of forgotten about or thought were unimportant, but then wind up in this collection and offer you this window to the past. But this is really, this archive is a treasure. All the CUNY archives is actually not here, but also much of the research for this book was done in archives that are part of the CUNY system. The Baruch College Archive, the Hostos Archive, the Center for Puerto Rican Studies at Hunter College. These really form the backbone of this book, and it couldn't really have happened without them. At this archive, I used mostly the mayoral papers. So both the papers of Abraham Beame, who was the mayor during the fiscal crisis, that's the main topic of this book, and the archive also has a remarkable set of oral histories with Beame and some of his companions and compatriots, where he talks about his childhood. This is material that doesn't exist anywhere else, and most of these oral histories were carried out by Richard Lieberman, some by other people too, but they are an extraordinary resource. I have Doug DiCarlo, who the head archivist. I have extensive email correspondence from 2013, 2014, where we were going back and forth. I was trying to find these things, he was getting them. We were making all these arrangements. There's also an amazing set of city council papers here, which I used a bit for this book, but could have done even more with. So it's just an amazing set of resources and so fun to work with. So I strongly encourage everybody to check it out. And yes, there were many happy hours spent this is a much quieter place to work than the municipal archives, which was another site where a lot of this research was done. But this is a much calmer, the municipal archives has a lot of people who are doing family research and using these microfilm machines to do genealogical stuff. So this was a very lovely place to work and to do the work on this book. So thank you, infinite gratitude.
And thank you for this reminder that writing a book is essentially a collaborative process. Historians working with archivists, referees, editors. Your name is the only name on the front cover, understandably so, but so much effort was put into by so many individuals. So thank you for recognizing LaGuardia and Wagner Archives and some of our resources. This book is tremendous because in many ways it challenges conventional wisdom. It really reframed our understanding of the fiscal crisis of 1975 in New York City, a pivotal moment in New York City history indeed. The traditional narrative, Kim, was that, okay, New York in a fiscal crisis in 1975, it was the fault of New York liberal politicians who were overly generous in providing social services to the citizens of New York. And this goes back to, you trace it back to, to LaGuardia and the New Deal in the 1930s, and Mayors Wagner, Lindsay, and Beame from the 50s to the 70s. What kinds of social services? Well, we have free higher education here at the City University of New York. We don't charge tuition. There's a vast network of public hospitals, municipal hospitals, public health clinics, public libraries, parks, playgrounds, swimming pools, powerful public sector unions, unionized individuals. Going back to 1958, the Little Wagner Act that allowed for public employees to organize, bargain collectively, getting generous pensions and other benefits. New York City also was very supportive of the war on poverty, initiated during the presidency of Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s, provides generous welfare benefits. And before you know it, well, the debt is exceeding, we're not taking in enough revenue. And city controllers are recognizing this, but papering over the debt and maybe engaging in some budget manipulation. And now, as President Adams indicated, the crisis really comes to a head after Mayor Beame was elected in 1973, 1974, and 75. So it was the fault of New York liberal politicians, and by extension, the nation's liberal politics. That's the traditional narrative. You challenge it. And would you tell us how you challenge this conventional wisdom?
Well, I think the book is partly about, so first of all, challenging that story. The book charts some of the other reasons that the fiscal crisis happened as it did. It talks about the recessions that gripped the city in the late 60s and early 70s. It talks about the decline of manufacturing in New York and some of the context for that, the federal investment in highways, changes in trade policy that made it much easier for garment manufacturers in particular, but also electronics manufacturers to go overseas, or to go first to the South and the Southern United States and then go overseas. And it talks also a bit about the changing context nationally, rising interest rates that made it harder for cities to borrow, and the declining, the new options opening up financially to banks and to wealthy people who wanted to put their money in places other than cities and in municipal debt. So it talks about there's a broader context in which the fiscal crisis happened, and which I think bears much of the responsibility for why the city was perennially short on funds in the late 60s, early 70s, and why the banks eventually stopped being willing to work with the city any longer to sell its debt. Behind this, though, I talk about a set of political priorities, and that there were, and I think this is where this traditional narrative actually has, it's not that it's true literally about why the crisis happened, but it is important. And it matters because at the back of the fiscal crisis are a set of questions about what should the living conditions of working class, middle class people in a city be? Do people have the right to expect affordable and effective transit? Do they have the right to a rich public sector of libraries, museums, parks, public art? Do you have the right to have musical education in your child's public school? Should people be able to expect high quality health care without having to pay enormous premiums through a private insurance system? What can the public hospital system be expected to provide? Should you be able to attend college? Should higher education be a right that is available to the entire society? Is that a social good to create an educated populace and to have the upward mobility economically that comes from being able to earn a college degree if you do not have parents who went to college, if you don't come from a wealthy family? So in a way, those questions are at the back of the fiscal crisis, because a commitment, the answer in some ways, this is all, the post-war city was by no means a utopia. There were many different inequalities and divisions within that city, especially and most powerfully racial inequalities, but also continued economic inequality. You know, these things were never extended equally to everybody, even in New York, but nonetheless, in the post-war years, there was a sense of commitment around those things that made it possible to attain them, even in part, and which is part of what accounts for the the existence of a free system of higher education, is part of what accounts for the expansion of that all throughout. And LaGuardia is one of many institutions that opened over the course of the late 40s to the early 70s. And the world in which that was seen as a common good and a common interest and a product of a society, and that came out of a particular time and place. And in the 70s, it stopped. And I think in many ways we live still in the aftermath of that, of the breaking of that kind of the attacks on that vision. And we are still sort of in the long coda to what changed in and around. There still is a lot of disagreement about these questions, which came to a head in a particular way in New York in the mid-1970s.
I like your focus on federal policy too.
Right.
And let's not forget about suburbanization.
Mm-hmm.
Policies passed by the federal government after World War II to encourage home ownership in the suburbs. So there is indeed an exodus of the middle class from New York City to the suburbs of Long Island, Westchester County, northern New Jersey, from the 50s and 70s to the 70s, and we're losing part of our tax base as a result. So this certainly contributes to the fiscal crisis. It's not just fiscally irresponsible New York City politicians who are extravagant and overly generous, but these broader federal trends are contributing to this looming crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. There is a huge public investment in the highways and in the mortgages that make possible the growth of suburbs on Long Island, that then the taxes that those are kept go into city coffers. So
A. Beame was elected mayor in 1973. He had been comptroller during the part of the mayoralty of Robert Wagner and John Lindsay as well. And he was aware of this looming crisis. He had a CPA, he was a graduate of the City College of New York, associated with old Democratic machine politics from Brooklyn, Clubhouse Democrat, as Ed Koch used to refer to him. His response, he's going to have a comptroller, Harrison J. Golden, who's really going to be a thorn in his side, that we need to do audits of the city's finances, and these were very revealing, picked up by the media. And how is Abe Beame going to respond to this looming crisis after he's elected in 73 and takes office in 74?
So Beame, I don't know how many of you have heard of Abe Beame, but Abe Beame was a product of working class New York. He had come here as an infant and grown up in poverty on the Lower East Side. He spent his childhood playing at the settlement houses there. He went to City College, he studied accounting, and he worked his way up through the Democratic political machine in the city. He was very, very short. There are many photographs of him kind of standing next to other people or kind of having had the mics adjusted down for him. I like to think he might even be a little shorter than I am, so he was very petite. And he was also the city's first kind of openly Jewish mayor. LaGuardia was sort of Jewish, but not not in any practicing way. He was an Episcopalian. So he was, but Beame was the city's first Jewish mayor. And Beame was part of what happens in the fiscal crisis, and this is one of the stories told in the book, is that there's a generational clash between Beame and his comptroller. The comptroller is the person who kind of manages the city's budget and authenticates its books. Our comptroller now is Brad Lander. And Lander and Adams also have a lot of tension, somewhat similar to Beame and Golden. Golden was very young. Golden was in his late 30s. He was, I forget where he went to school, it's in the book, but he was kind of a highly educated guy.
Yale and Princeton.
Yeah, so he was like educated at these elite institutions, and he had working in his comptroller's office a whole clique of other young, up-and-coming people, many of whom had kind of ties to the counterculture. This is the late 60s and early 70s. People were coming out of the anti-war movement. There also is a very, this is the age of the young lords and the Black Panthers in the city. Although there was less of that, the activists in those circles were not really so connected to the comptroller's office. But there's a kind of, the people who came to the comptroller's office, there were people who had, kind of dropped out of, they were kind of anti-authoritarian. And they came in and they had no investment in Beame, they had no investment in keeping things as they were. And they were, and Golden was an ambitious young guy who kind of did want to unseat Beame, and Beame couldn't stand Golden and knew that his comptroller was gunning for him. And so this tension developed, and it was basically impossible. I mean, there were many reasons why Beame had trouble fully confronting what was the fiscal problems of the city. There were a lot of political reasons why Beame had trouble really acknowledging the scope of the problem, but certainly this personal dynamic did not help. And just to give a little sense, probably the two biggest things that the city was doing that got it into trouble were that it was using its capital budget, which is the part of the budget where you borrow to spend on long-term investments. And these are the things that if you go and you vote for a bond referendum, that is what you're voting for as part of the capital budget. And it's supposed to go for things like schools, roads, street lamps, other kinds of long-term public projects. The Beame administration, and to some extent Lindsay before him, were dipping into that to pay for things like school textbooks, which are they're not really what that kind of fund is supposed to go for. The other major thing that they were doing was really increasing the amount of short-term debt they were taking out. And they were backing it with these bonds that were supposed to be guaranteed. So borrowing money and saying, well, we'll pay it back with a future tax. We'll pay it back with some revenue yet to come. We'll pay it back with a new bond issue. None of this had actually been accumulated, and the debt tended to be due in about a year. The interest rates kept going up on it. And so the amount of the city's budget that was going towards this was growing and growing. And this is really what got out of whack in a short-term way. There was this underlying issue, but this set of choices that the administration made wound up creating the situation that gave the people who were lending the city money a lot of power. The banks and the people who were financing its debt, because the city became so reliant on them, they became more and more powerful in saying what should happen. And it was very hard for Beame to fully acknowledge that. As soon as you acknowledged it, you would create I think there was a sense you would create a panic. And beyond that, Beame he believed in the city. He believed in New York. It was too big to fail. And he didn't really, he didn't have the sort of political tools to try to address the problem at the level at which it needed to be addressed.
That's right. The city, according to Mayor Beame, is too big to fail. Okay, the banks, we hope, will continue providing loans. The credit rating agencies are playing along as well. Moody's, Standard & Poor's, giving the city's notes and bonds high ratings. So, okay, we're good.
And it's real, they all did. I mean, the banks, the rating agencies, they were all happy to participate in this for a long time. So it wasn't like there was a gradual off-ramp. They were all just happy to keep going along with it, even when they might have, the information was starting to come out that might have, if they had an interest in trying to preserve the city's social institutions, there would have been many points at which you could figure out an alternative.
Right, and if the city approaches defaults and on the brink of bankruptcy, surely the federal government will provide a bailout, argued Beame. But this takes us to the presidential administration of Gerald Ford, of course, who assumed the office of presidency after President Nixon resigned against the backdrop of the Watergate scandal in 1974. Would you talk a little bit about President Ford's attitude? He had been in Congress from Michigan, a moderate Republican, but he was opposed to the Great Society, to organized labor, to traditional liberalism in general. His attitude, but he did have, his vice president was Nelson Rockefeller, former governor of New York, a liberal Republican governor. So, but his inner circle would take a strong stance against the possibility of a bailout. Would you talk about President Ford and his team?
Sure. So President Ford, as you know, is a Midwesterner. He's a longtime congressperson, and he is also, in 1975, he was never elected because he was, he became president accidentally, effectively, after Nixon resigned. And he was facing a challenge from the right at this point. Reagan was the governor of California. Reagan was on the march. And Ford's administration also, it did contain Nelson Rockefeller, who was a liberal Republican, but it also contained Alan Greenspan, who people might remember as the head of the Federal Reserve Bank, but who was a devotee of the author Ayn Rand, one of the leading libertarian authors of the mid-20th century, who wrote The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and other people who were very committed to a set of free market ideas and thought that New York had just spent too much. If they got any federal aid or any federal assistance, that would just encourage other cities to do the same thing. And I think there was also a kind of an underlying racial and also sexual politics to this. This is in the aftermath of, or it's at this moment of the kind of rise of the civil rights movement, of a kind of radical Black and Latino politics in New York. And these were things that Ford and to some extent the Republican Party, or the increasingly conservative Republican Party at that moment, did not like and wanted to they represented order against this. They also, this is in the aftermath of Stonewall and the rise of gay rights in New York and the era of gay liberation, and it actually is also right after, New York is one of the first laws that had kind of passing a state law to liberalize abortion. This is after Roe versus Wade, but not that long after. And it's also a center of kind of radical feminism as well. And I think the Ford administration saw New York as an example, not just of fiscal chaos, but what they thought was a kind of moral and social chaos. They did not see these things as liberatory. They experienced them as a challenge, and they wanted to insist that the federal government should not help this, it should punish it. There are many comparisons of New York to a junkie, for example, that has to be cut off. So I think there's a sense of wanting to penalize the city, and a sense that things like free higher education or expanding the availability of higher education or hospitals or what have you, mass transit, these are not things that the federal government should hold as priorities. These are not things the federal government should try to support. Beame tries to fight back and says, well, we pay more in income taxes than we get back from the federal government. That was true. Beame says we are and have been historically the great space of welcoming new immigrants to the country and bringing them into the United States. Also true, and we have a social infrastructure that supports that. But the Ford administration was not interested in these arguments.
It was a broader critique of liberalism with rising conservatism in the mid-1970s, and New York was emblematic of these liberal politics. And yeah, sure, and even when President Nixon was elected and took office in 1969, there will be disinvestment in cities, an abandonment of the war on poverty, a concentration to fighting crime, law and order, an emphasis on the silent majority, people in support of the Vietnam War. So yes, a broader critique of liberalism at this time. But Going back to New York State, we see the establishment of a state-controlled organization, the MAC, the Municipal Assistance Corporation. Kim, would you tell us a little bit about what MAC was, what the purpose of MAC was, and the creation of it?
Yeah, so when it becomes clear that the federal government is not going to help, the solution at the state level is basically to create a new agency, the Municipal Assistance Corporation, which will be staffed by bankers especially, although a couple of people who nominally represented the public. But its job was to sell new bonds to the public that would be backed by a special sales tax. So basically borrowing more money, but this time with a special tax dedicated to the bonds, so hopefully getting people to pick them up. And then this corporation, this agency would be able to give the money to the city if the city starts to make cutbacks. So the Municipal Assistance Corporation is the first of several attempts to impose from the state level a set of budget cuts on the city. And they're pretty explicit about this. So another thing that I looked at in the book were the minutes of the Municipal Assistance Corporation. These are what's at Baruch College and its archives. And they're pretty explicit in saying what we need, that the people of New York, they have expected too much for too long. We need to radically cut back what their expectations are going to be, and we need to do it, I think they say the shock impact is important because we want the entire banking community nationwide to see that there's been a change. So they're very explicit about we need to renegotiate what the citizens of New York can expect, and that's the only way that we'll be able to get people to invest in the city again.
So there will be budget cuts, cuts in social services, layoffs to public employees. So you kill the city to save the city.
That's kind of the vision was you have to radically shrink what the city does. And that is what happened. The public sector of the city shrank, the public employment declined by about 20% in the years that immediately followed the fiscal crisis. Does it save the city? Well, it does increase a lot of, this is a theory that we hear today. Cutting services means you can lower taxes, so maybe businesses will come in and that will kind of get things going in the right direction again. Unfortunately, cutting services also means that businesses and people tend to leave. One of the reasons people have to live in New York is the public sector and the public services. If those don't exist, people are going to go. So I think that it's a question of what is the policy. But the theory they were operating on was this idea of radical contraction. And this was linked to some sense that in the long term it would be good for the city. In the short term it would get the bonds paid back.
And so the city will lose control over its own finances, Mayor Beame, with the establishment of another state agency, the Emergency Finance Control Board, around this time. Would you talk a little bit about this state agency and what it represented?
Right, so the problem with the Municipal Assistance Corporation is that it did depend on people to buy the bonds, and despite its best efforts, people actually still were not buying these bonds, banks were not buying these bonds. So then yet another state agency is created. This one again, it has some people who represent the business community, including the chief executive of the manufacturer of Colt revolvers, and William Ellinghouse, I think, from AT&T. So it has people representing business. It then has some politicians, like the mayor is on the Emergency Financial Control Board, and there are 3 public representatives who are less well-defined, but essentially are also representing business interests. And despite many requests, no community representative was allowed on the board, no labor union representative was allowed on this board. And the Emergency Financial Control Board is kind of the back, it basically takes final budgetary authority away from the city. It does not actually, there's a lot of debates on this board. I mean, in a way, like these things often are, part of what the Emergency Financial Control Board does is authorize the city government to make changes that it didn't really, that it had been previously reluctant to carry out. So the Emergency Financial Control Board actually didn't get into the weeds that much of saying close that hospital, or lay off these workers, or extend the school day by 90 minutes, all of which were things that happened. But the board didn't insist on those things itself. It kind of stayed in the background by and large, but it did provide the city. The city could then point to it and say, if we don't close the hospital, lay off the workers, extend the school day, then the board will make us do it. So it was this kind of split of authority that made it possible, or gave the city's government the oomph that it needed to push these things through that were wildly unpopular at the time.
And Mayor Beame and his team ultimately appealed for a federal bailout in October 1975, and it takes us to the famous Daily News headline, Ford to City, drop dead, in bold letters. He never actually said President Ford dropped dead, but in effect, isn't that what he meant in so many words? What then happens with respect, the city never actually went bankrupt because President Ford, he wanted to revise the terms of make it easier for the city to file bankruptcy, and will provide short-term loans. Would you talk about that?
Well, so the way that this finally gets settled, and I think there's a lot of kind of details and twists and turns, and one of the things this was definitely a challenge in writing the history, is kind of staying focused on what matters and not getting sidetracked into all of the some of the details which are interesting, but not, I think, they can just take a lot of energy. I think at the heart of it, the city, the federal government at first said, we will sign, Ford said, I will not sign any bill that gives any bailout to the city of New York. This is what generates the drop dead headline. There is an immediate backlash against this, including from many international leaders. This is also the time of the Cold War, and there was a sense that the United States had just been defeated in Vietnam, that it would look terrible for capitalism, for the center of Wall Street to declare bankruptcy, and there were many appeals to Ford from many business leaders and international leaders to not let that happen. At the same time, the city's bankers put together a financing plan and managed to borrow a lot of money, including from city unions. And then finally, the Beame, the new boards have been created. Beame agrees to a program of dramatic cutbacks. All of that is in place. And then Ford says, well, okay, here you can have some money to tide you over. So the city does not go bankrupt. But what it does do is agree to this dramatic set of budget cuts, and to a whole range of different things, including starting tuition at CUNY, which was one of the things that, despite it had relatively little impact on the city's fiscal position, but it was one of the things that Ford had actually, from the very first meeting with Beame, had really insisted on. It had a lot of symbolic importance, and so all these things, the next few years are a hodgepodge of different cutbacks to the basic social services of the city. And a lot of the really famous images of New York in the late 70s, of the subway cars covered with graffiti, of the Lower East Side or the South Bronx, the buildings kind of in piles of rubble and collapse, those images actually come, they're from the whole 70s, but a lot of them are really from the late 70s, when there was just this extreme disinvestment in basic aspects of city life. Sanitation, the whole thing has this enormous there's just a pullback from all kinds of parts of the city.
Yeah. So now we're faced with cuts to social services, with layoffs. As you mentioned, CUNY is affected. We'll start to charge tuition at the City University of New York, a major turning point. Not only that, but a couple schools were threatened with closure. John Jay College of Criminal Justice by Columbus Circle in Manhattan, Hostos Community College in the South Bronx. York College in Jamaica, Queens, a 4-year school, would be converted to a 2-year school. Medgar Evers College in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, also would be converted to a 2-year school. At least that's what the plan was. You devoted a chapter, as President Adams indicated, to the scene at Hostos. Could you tell us a little bit about what Hostos represented in the South Bronx when it was established and its response to these proposed closure, to the proposed closure?
I don't know how much people know about Hostos, but Hostos was founded in, I think, 1970, and it's kind of near 149th and the Grand Concourse, and it opened initially as a bilingual 2-year school. It's not actually any longer, but it opened initially. It was the only such college in the system, so it was offering instruction in both English and Spanish, and it opened in an abandoned tire factory. So kind of taking a leftover, or kind of a building that had been abandoned by the industry that had been in it and repurposing it for something new. It had a population that was mostly Puerto Rican, Dominican, Black. There were a lot of women students at Hostos and a lot of parents going there. It was closely tied to Lincoln Hospital, which was fairly close, and so people could go there and get degrees that allowed them to work in the at the hospital. It was a beloved institution, and at a moment, as we mentioned at the beginning, of rising arson, rising fire, which affected the South Bronx especially powerfully. And it was a sign of hope and investment in the future, and was deeply beloved by the community. And in the original plan after the kind of breaking of the news of the fiscal crisis, restructuring CUNY was one of the agenda points, and Hostos was initially slated to be closed along with these other schools and converted. But Hostos was just going to be shut down altogether, and the operation was going to move to, I think, up by where Lehman is now. So, the community mobilized, both the students, faculty, and the larger community of the neighborhood mobilized in this Save Hostos movement that was quite powerful, quite dramatic, and was ultimately successful. Hostos is there to this day. The campus was at one point occupied by students and some faculty, but mostly students, and they set up a child care center in the president's office. I hope President Adams doesn't mind mentioning this, yes. And one of the things that I noticed when I went to visit, or when I did a lot of research there, one of the things I noticed was that there is to this day a child care center kind of on the first floor as you come in to get to the archives. So anyway, this is an example of a local community mobilization that was actually successful.
Though, as you point out, even though the school did not close, the number of full-time faculty was reduced from 170 to 100, and the nursing department was shut down.
This is true. So the cutbacks were there, they were real, it was impossible. The local mobilization wasn't capable of challenging the larger pattern of budget cuts through the city as a whole.
Many firehouses were threatened by closure as well. Many did indeed close. There was one in the neighborhood, Williamsburg, Engine Company 212, the People's Firehouse. You write about eloquently and the movement to occupy the firehouse to block the closure. Would you talk a little bit about what happened at Engine Company 212?
This is sort of extraordinary. If people have been to Williamsburg lately, you know how the neighborhood was very, very different at this moment in the mid-70s. But this is a neighborhood, a wood-frame neighborhood. Many of the houses are wooden houses, and it is in this age of fire. And when the firehouse was threatened, people actually went and they just occupied the firehouse, and they stayed in the firehouse, and they slept there year-round. There was a sense that if they left, the fire trucks would be taken out and it would be closed. Now, it is very notable. This was also a large community mobilization. It was led by this guy, Adam Vineski, who had not really been a political person beforehand. There are these great photos of his kids kind of hanging out on the fire trucks. But it, this was allowed to stay. I mean, it was a kind of full-scale occupation of this firehouse that went on for 14 or 16 months. No police came in and tried to fish people out of the firehouse. In a way, the police probably tacitly supported it and were willing to just let it exist and be there. It's kind of really inconceivable in a way to think of something like that happening today. A very different relationship and dynamic with I guess both the sense of the right of these protesters who said, this is our firehouse, that's why we're calling it the People's Firehouse, and we are, it's our neighborhood, we need this to protect it. And that legitimacy of that claim was kind of honored by the fact that those people were never fished out of the firehouse and arrested, as they surely could have been in principle.
One thing that struck me about these community mobilizations in Williamsburg against the closure of the firehouse at Hostos Community College in the South Bronx, you also wrote about the closing of the public hospital, the Sydenham Hospital in Harlem, is that it wasn't an organized citywide movement as it maybe might have been, all of these individuals in local communities and neighborhoods facing cuts, closures, layoffs, but they seem to be more like local affairs. And it seems to me there was a real opportunity, maybe there was, to mobilize, to form a movement. Any successful social movement needs coalition building. So why not the people in Harlem protesting the closing of Sydenham Hospital work together with those in Williamsburg against the closing of the firehouse, with Hostos Community College. You see where I'm going with this, but it seemed rather fragmented and scattered, these local community mobilizations. Would you talk about this?
Yeah, I think it was very neighborhood based, and I think it was difficult to build a citywide movement. It was difficult because of the divisions in the city. It was difficult because it involved I think having the full support of citywide institutions like the unions would have been helpful. That was hard to attain. I think actually even this flyer, or this flyer produced by the police, which is on some level a flyer protesting cutbacks, this was actually given out at the airports. Their idea was to give it to tourists who are coming to New York. But it reveals, as we said and talked about it, is not just, it reveals a kind of fear of the city, and it points to the sense of divisions within the city, the role of racism really in the city at this point, and the sense of kind of a fear-mongering, and that people who are really being threatened here are kind of white, affluent New Yorkers, and that so it kind of points to some of those tensions that I think were underneath why it was harder to build a citywide mobilization. I also think, by and large, it was very difficult, as it often is, to contest the logic of the cutbacks. You say there's a budget shortfall. Well, what are you going to do? What is your solution if it's not to make these cuts? And I think the political work that you have to do to say, well, actually, this is created because the boundaries of the city mean you can't tax the suburbs, because the federal government should really have a deeper commitment to public health programs so that cities don't bear as much of the cost. It touches these much larger political questions, and the tools that are involved in saving one firehouse don't give you easily the set of connections you have to make that happen, and not just intellectually, but politically, and in terms of building coalitions, and in terms of affecting different layers of government. It's just big. I mean, it's a big, undertaking.
And maybe racial politics were at work too. So for me, it's seemingly difficult to imagine white, ethnic, working class folks in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, Polish Americans, to a large extent, forming a coalition with maybe African Americans in Harlem, African Americans and Puerto Ricans in the South Bronx. Is that fair to say?
The firehouse, that probably is true across the board as a general thing, although the firehouse people the firehouse became a real magnet for people across the city. So people from Hostos would come, were in dialogue with those at the firehouse. And also there was one point at which the city said, well, we'll close this fire station in Fort Greene, which at that point was mostly a black neighborhood, and you can, and you can keep the one in Northside. And the activists said, no, that's not an acceptable arrangement to us. That's not the way that we want this to happen. So I think there was the potential there, and maybe especially among that group of people who had been, they had experienced a kind of political education, and their ideas about the world, wherever they started out, had changed. So
this takes us to 1977. We're going to have a blackout in New York City, mid-July 1977, the summer of Sam. Horrible tragedies occurring in the city. The blackout is going to affect, it's going to be citywide, and there would be widespread looting in neighborhoods in the South Bronx and Bushwick, Brooklyn, just to name a couple. And how would the federal government and others, commentators, respond to this? Wasn't it, in a sense, well, New York City can't handle its finances, it's in social chaos, and it sort of justified these cuts, and it's going to lead to contribute to a contentious Democratic primary for mayor. We're going to have Mario Cuomo, Beame will run for re-election, Bella Abzug, Herman Badillo, Percy Sutton, and Ed Koch. And Ed Koch is going to really demagogue, frankly, on the death penalty, even though the New York City mayor, his point of view has no bearing on the death penalty. It's a state issue. But anyway, he's going to really emphasize law and order, cracking down, referring to the looters in vile terms and vitriolic terms, and ultimately he would win in 1977. Would you talk a little bit about his platform and how he represented a departure from the previous liberal mayors, Beame, Lindsay, and Wagner?
Right, well, Ed Koch was he really embraced the framework of austerity for the city. He describes the city as in need of a new population in a way. His inaugural address is kind of he says, come east, young pioneers, and encouraging, sort of describing or calling into being a new population of yuppies to come into the city and to remake it. And he also, he's very on board with all of the cutbacks. And he also, it's not just, he wants to make the cuts happen, but he also really wants to embrace to be seen politically as the person who's making these cuts happen. So in some ways, when there's a protest, he has a special delight in ignoring it and shutting it down. This is part of what happens at Sydenham Hospital in Harlem, but it's kind of his MO across the board, that he's going to show you have to be, you can't respond to democratic pressure, you can't respond to public pressure, you're going to ignore these protesters who previously there had been a certain sense that they had a certain legitimacy. For Koch, they become a kind of unruly mob that has to be shut down, and certainly doesn't have any real legitimate claim. Their anger and their vision for the city has nothing in it that you should listen to or abide by. So Koch kind of brings this new ethos into the city government, and he is able, over the beginning of his, over his first term in office, to balance the budget. And it also is this time of, there is the kind of the growth of finance in the city really begins early in the Koch years. There's a whole set of kind of giveaways to business, including, this is when President Trump actually gets his first start in the city as a real estate developer at this time, thanks to a large city tax break that allowed him to build the Grand Hyatt Hotel, which is next to Grand Central Station. So this is a moment of kind of the reconfiguration of the city and a new shift towards finance and business. I want to also say, though, that this is really heralded, or the kind of the bringing in of finance and business is seen as what saved New York. I think this is really exaggerated in the not just popular perception, but the literature. And the other thing that really happens is that new immigration saves the city. That there is this kind of wave of immigration, which is a result of lots of things, but partly the newly liberalized immigration laws, which have changed in the 60s, and the waves of immigration that have transformed, especially Queens, but with Latin American immigration, South Asian immigration, East Asian immigration, the flow of people, and kind of Eastern European immigration, the flows of people that come into the neighborhoods that have been hollowed out by suburbanization, that really creates a new population for the city, at least as much as the kind of call-outs to the recruiting of the investment banks and so on.
Yeah, okay. One last point before we turn it over to Q&A and the trivia. And I really like your point that this new pro-business attitude to encourage real estate developers like Donald Trump to convert the Commodore Hotel to the Grand Hyatt to benefit from tax abatement policies, these new policies to encourage corporate expansion, an increasing reliance on the private sector, the formation of conservancies like the Central Park Conservancy. We see a decrease in the public sector, a rise in the private sector. So now ultimately the Central Park Conservancy will take over the maintenance of Central Park, to name one famous example. And I really like your point that this was not inevitable. You know, we've got who is in control, who is making decisions, the elite from the business community, bankers, the corporate community, have a vision, a neoliberal vision about what will happen in New York. And as you rightly point out, I'm persuaded this wasn't a conspiracy, premeditated, but there was an opportunity and to establish, to articulate a new vision. But by no means was this inevitable, but this was people making policy decisions, debating, and concluding that this pro-business and a departure away from traditional liberalism, cutting the public sector, laying off individuals, public employees, cutting social services. You know, these were all highly contested decisions. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, I think I guess I would just, before, I'm curious to hear people's questions, but I think it is, we live very much in a city that has been shaped by all of this. And it's actually, New York today is radically unequal economically in ways that it just was not in 1980 even. And the gap between the richest and poorest people in the city is so much higher than it was in the late 70s, early 80s. And I think that really affects our experience of the city in a very day-to-day way. It affects what it feels like to live here and the kinds of choices that we all have to make. And it is these things can feel so all-powerful, but actually they really are the product of choices, decisions, and conflicts. The fiscal crisis, one of the things that was very interesting and enjoyable about writing about it is that it was a moment when a lot of these tensions in society came to the forefront very suddenly and abruptly. It was a time when a lot happened quickly. And I think history is like that. Things move along slowly and there are these tectonic plates and things shifting under the surface, but then there are these time periods where a lot happens very fast, and you wind up living in a society where things, in a span of a few years, the dynamic has changed dramatically. So I think in certain ways it seems as though, hard to say altogether right now, but that we may be living in another moment like that of sudden and rapid and profound change. And when you're in the thick of that, it is worth remembering, or just having a sense that one's actions actually, the decisions are being made and things are happening around us that may feel as though they have this force of inevitability, but actually they are things that we can affect. They are things that not individually, and I think the concentration of power at the top is another feature of this type of moment. But the things are not, the outcome is not predetermined from the beginning. So the fiscal crisis certainly is a time period where that sensibility was I thought about that set of questions a lot while working on the book.
Thank you, Kim. I want to open it up to audience Q&A. Do you have any questions? Yes.
Well, I'm just curious. Well, first of all, thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for writing this book. We're collaborators. And thank you for having us. Who are those power players in the 70s? Is it political bosses, like the heads of the political parties? Is it the Wall Street industry? Is it real estate? Is it foreign actors? And I also think about this in reference to today. Like, how did that change? Like, I didn't really realize that Wall Street wasn't so dominant before the 80s. And of course, that led to a mess, right, in the 2000s. And who are those players then, and who are they today?
That's a great question. I think, I think in the fiscal crisis era, it is a cast of characters that certainly includes the political bosses, and especially the kind of Democratic Party in the city. The property owners, big property owners, definitely play an important role. The city's unions, actually, and their leaders have the unions themselves are pretty new at that moment, but they have a lot of weight. And then there are these bankers, but the banks are quite different than Wall Street as a sector is now. And we can talk a bit more about how and why that is, but the banks and the bankers are important in the city. The city needs them, they help finance the debt, but they are much less. I think one thing which is actually quite different between the 70s and today is that this whole cast of characters, even the people who are trying to impose this austerity politics on the city, there is a really strong sense of the city as something that they're all quite invested in and that they see as important, and this rhetoric. This is maybe a little earlier for the banks, where it's an honor to work with the city. And there is this sense of New York as a very distinctive place. And I actually think one thing, nationally, it's another set of questions, but a framework in which it kind of embraces the people associated with Wall Street today are much less connected, I think, to the infrastructure of New York. They see themselves as part of a global network. There's also a stronger ethos of self-enrichment as the way that you serve the greater good, that there's no difference between those things. If you are thinking about, the greater good at all, you conceptualize it, your relationship to it, as just in terms of unleashing your own, your own accumulation. There's no division between that and the common good. And I think that actually, I also think the unions played a part in the city, which was problematic in the 70s, but it is interesting that they were there at all. I think they had a power and cachet that's quite different than what you see in the city at this moment, where, again, unions still play an important role in the politics of the city. I think DC 37, and endorsing Audrey and Adams, this is still a notable fact and important, and there is a lot of mobilizing that the unions can do in the city. But I think that in other ways, I think they're less identified with the common good of the city than was the case in the mid-70s. I think union membership in New York City in the 70s was, also private sector union membership was much higher than is the case today. So it's a kind of a changing dynamic in all those ways. But it's a great question. I think the nature of the American elite, or New York's elite, is a really, and what it actually is today is, I think, not altogether obvious either for the city or for the country as a whole.
Yeah, Brian?
First of all, I just want to say thank you very much for this book, and also congratulations on this recognition. I think it's a great book. I love it. So one of the things I really love about it is that you emphasize the power of community engagement. I think that the People's Firehouse is a great example of that. One of the things you said in the talk today was about how that kind of community engagement, like people taking over a firehouse, is unimaginable today. I'm wondering what you would say to what are some of the conditions at that time which enabled that kind of event to take place, and why can't that happen today?
Yeah, I think I didn't mean to say it totally couldn't happen today, but what's really remarkable to me about the firehouse episode in today's context is the police response or non-response. I think this is, I think even in the 70s, the fact that the people of Williamsburg or North Williamsburg, it was a white working class population. I think it would have been harder for a black group of neighborhood activists to take over a firehouse and have the police respond in the same relatively, pretty restrained, or in the case of the firehouse, totally restrained way. I don't know if that would have happened or not, even in the 70s. So is something that I think that episode was kind of distinctive. But it is, I do think the policing of protests today, and really post 9/11 in the city overall, but I also think a real, acceleration of it after 2020 and the Black Lives Matter protests, that right now we are at a point of very little police tolerance for public protest, especially in the form of the kind of the occupation of the public facility. There's a lot of different things one can say about the campus protests and encampments of the past year, but one element of those, they were occupying public space, and I think that the response to that is, that it was quite intense and has only become more. I think that's really what I was thinking of. I think it is interesting to think, are there, could you do that? Or is there anything you could protest in that particular way that would, not meet the same type of response? I do think one thing is having enough people and that you are able to make the claim that this speaks for the community. I think trying to occupy things, if you don't have a large number of people who are willing to support and buttress that occupation, just makes no sense at all, ever. And you need to have, for that type of thing to seem legitimate, it has to be a contest over the use of the space where your proposed use meets with the support of much of the community. So you could imagine that happening, I think, in certain ways, certain places, that it would have the support of the police as a high bar, and that's kind of what happened in that episode.
So 2 more questions, Natalie.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk today. I've learned a lot. I'm a CUNY archives worker, so I really appreciate the shout out to all of our CUNY archives. Thank you for using them. I'm kind of curious about process for you, and I would love to hear about any moment of discovery in the archives, or something that was a surprise that maybe took you in a different direction than you had been expecting. Just something memorable that you found that was kind of an aha moment, if there's anything that comes to mind like that.
there were quite a few. I think finding the MAC minutes at Baruch was certainly one. And actually, it is very interesting because a lot of the Baruch minutes are online. Someone at some point digitized those, but they didn't digitize the really interesting ones. So those you had to be in the archive to find. That was a great moment. I think actually a lot of the correspondence with the mayor, and some of this is actually on the LaGuardia, the website here, but this kind of thing of people writing to the mayor with their observations about cutbacks and about the city's problems. And honestly, people have so many interesting things to say and are so just so perceptive and so thoughtful in all of their different responses that those are always very surprising and interesting to me to read. And then finally, actually, there was a change. This is a little different than an archive, but it was, some of this book was written through oral histories that then led people to sharing their papers. And there were a series of those that were really quite revelatory to me, or kind of talking to Comptroller Golden, and then he gave me the phone number of somebody else and who worked in his office, and then that person shared all of these memos with me. So like that kind of thing, and those memos kind of revealed this countercultural group in the city's public agencies before the crisis that was really opposed to Beame, and that kind of thing was really great. Also photographs, I have to say, actually, all both the Hostos collection has amazing photographs, some of which are in the book, and then also the Hunter Archives. There's a couple of photographers there whose work is collected there, which is just, just wonderful material. So, the book took a long time to work on it. I worked on it in fits and starts also. There were periods where I did a lot of work and then stopped for a while and then started again. So it was definitely a kind of a journey, the process of writing it.
One more quick question and trivia. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm also a CUNY archives worker and been thinking a lot about the history of CUNY, and so I'm curious, you spoke briefly about Comptroller Golden and then sort of his opposite counterculture in some sort of way, but I'm curious, like, there had been the open admissions protests at CCNY,
right.
And there had also been this sort of new sweep of thought at the universities where these student radicals had sort of left the universities, but now there were these new waves of thought. And so I'm wondering what you can tell us about this sort of student radicals and where they went and how that influenced, say, like this neoliberal style or this sort of like idea of austerity.
Well, it's interesting because I think as of the mid-70s, a lot of the student radicals actually, the campuses are still quite radical in New York. It's not at all the way things will go later on. And, I think, but I mean, they're never only that either. I think, and I think this is actually, I mean, you probably have a sense of this, but there's all the history of the 60s at CUNY and the 60s, early 70s at CUNY actually is I think a history that still really needs to be written, that there were extremely intense protest movements, many of them about opening up the city system, the open admissions movement, the question of what really equal higher education would mean, racial inequality throughout the system, and just in a whole kind of the vision of higher education and what it represents for people. And many of the campuses have their own kind of internal conflicts. There's fierce conflicts over student government, for example. So all the institutions of the campuses become very politicized. And that still is the case when the fiscal crisis happens. And there is, there's a kind of, in some ways actually similar also to today, there's like a very robust critique of these institutions, which then come under attack from outside in ways that people hadn't been altogether expecting. So They were criticizing CUNY or the public hospitals, and then but nobody wanted them to be demolished. They wanted them to change, but then when you've been criticizing something, it's hard to turn around and then say, well, actually, we want to save this. This is probably another reason for the weaknesses of the movement in the city at the time. I think what happens to these people later? Well, some of them abandon their youthful radicalism, and they take some of their ethos of the counterculture, and then they take it into their later life in pursuit of upward mobility and so on and so forth, and they take a certain kind of the hostility to institutions that was part of 60s radicalism and skepticism about liberalism. They take that and they move to the right with it. But not everybody. There's other people who become kind of lifelong community activists in one way or another as well, and who I think continue to exercise a deep and not fully recognized in narratives of the city influence on New York in the 80s and 90s, and in some ways maybe even to the present day, but certainly in the 80s and 90s. They do continue to mobilize in many different ways and help create the city. It is also, I think, Fear City is a story of a partial transformation, but these institutions, obviously, we're here today, and we're, public institutions have a life and a capacity to endure a lot of the depredations that come against them. And this is not a story of a total transformation, it's a partial transformation, and the building blocks of this kind of democratic city, I think, still remain around us, and in the fact of the life of the city itself.
Thank you, Kim, and a round of applause for Kim. With the Fiorello LaGuardia Book Prize Award, but I haven't, so I'm really honored on behalf of LaGuardia and Wagner Archives to present you with this award, and then we can transition to trivia.
Thank you so much.
All right, Tara, ready?
Yeah.